and thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to Will today. I first made Will's acquaintance a little earlier this year when we were on the same festival circuit in Pakistan, and it's an unexpected joy to be reconnected with him in these almost impossibly beautiful surroundings, worthy of poetry. We had a little taste in that introduction of what the poetry pharmacy might be about. It has a very concrete form, embodied in, maybe you'd like to hold up one or two of those, Will, in book form. But of course, its origins are more abstract and nuts and bolts in the sense that it operates still like a real pharmacy. And I wonder if you could tell us about that pharmacy, when it came about and how.
Thank you. Well, I've spent my life trying to get poetry out of Poetry Corner. National Poetry Day and the Forward Prizes and so on were a little attempt at doing that. But one day, a friend who I was working with and who was going through a lot of problems in her life, her marriage broke up, her father died, and I was sending her poems to try and help her through her difficulties, told me she was programming a literary festival in England, in Cornwall, called Port Eliot, and would I come and talk about poetry. And she had the idea of setting me up in a tent with a shrink's couch and an armchair and a box of tissues. And she said, bring every poem that you could conceivably think would be useful for people. And she offered people a chance to book on a little blackboard slots of 20 minutes to come and tell me their worries. And I thought this would probably last for an hour. And 5 hours later, with a very full bladder, I snuck out of the tent for a little comfort break to see alarmingly that the blackboard was not just full for the day, but full for the festival. And suddenly, after spending all my life trying to get people interested in poetry, I realized that Jenny had come up with this most extraordinary idea. And that's where it all began.
But that hasn't been the end of it, has it? So it kind of took on a life of its own.
It really did. One of the people who came and told me her worries turned out to be a producer for BBC Radio. And literally the next Saturday, I was on a radio program on Radio 4. And again, the producer encouraged people to send in their anxieties that I could perhaps come up with a poem for. And on it went. The producer said that she'd had so many emails, she wondered if I could come back a few weeks later to do some more. And then I realized Jenny was really onto something. And bizarrely, about a month later, I was asked by the arts minister of the then coalition government in the UK if I would do a review of the public library network. And not being a kind of government inspector person, I offered to do a poetry pharmacy in every library I visited. And over about 18 months, I listened to well over 1,000 people's problems, one-on-one, and began to refine the process, I suppose.
I'm curious, how long does a session with you last?
20 minutes.
Right. I have the advantage, which other people don't have, of having watched a few interviews with you online, and I know that your crusade for poetry is much more extensive than this. So I'd like to rewind a little bit. You know, in my travels last year, I landed up in Greece and was offered a tour of the Acropolis. And the guide who took me around, he may have been telling me a story he thought I wanted to hear, but I was quite struck by something he mentioned in passing, which was that there is an amphitheater for performance at the foot of the Acropolis, one of the ancient Greek theaters, And close by was an ancient Greek medical center. I did ask Mary earlier for the correct pronunciation, and it's not her fault if I get it wrong, but I believe it's more or less an Asclepion was the name of these particular centers. But he told me that the logic of having a medical center close to a theater was that the Greeks approached healing as a holistic project. In other words, you might come to have an ailment of your body fixed, but at the same time, you needed to go to the theater to have the ailments of the soul looked after. And your pharmacy project, it seems to me, is reaching in a funny way for much the same thing. You mentioned, not now, but in some of these interviews, that when the Olympics took place in Britain, you had been outraged that there was no place, or seemed to be no place, for poetry in that endeavor. And that, again, going back to ancient Greece, the Greeks used to have a stadium for the athletic side of Olympics, and then a stadium for poetry. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that. I'm trying to imagine what would go on in a poetry stadium, like who speaks a poem faster than anyone else. I presume that's not, was not the object.
No, but when the Olympics were reinvented, there was quite a lot of enthusiasm for having a kind of cultural Olympics in parallel. And the whole idea of poetry as healing, goes back in time. The ancient Egyptians used to value, they used to sometimes bury people with a poem. So I think in every culture, poetry is very, very important. You know, it's the language of grace. It's part of, every religious text is filled with poetry. So I was horrified that when the British Olympics, or the Olympics happened in Britain, that they weren't planning to celebrate poetry. And rather ironically, I don't know whether any of you were in London when the Olympics happened, but they built this extraordinary park in East London, which was like a little bit of Dubai nestling in the middle of London. It was brand new, everything. And I managed to persuade the Olympic authorities to commission a number of poets to write poems that we were going to physically put into the landscape. And everyone wrote about what had been there before. The continuity of poetry, I think, is very important to us.
Yeah, that's a point I'd like to come back to in a little bit. But meantime, I'd like to go back, if you're open to it, to the origins of poetry in your life. The very first book I ever bought, and I saved up for weeks and weeks to be able to go out and buy this, was a copy of Yeats's collected poems. It was really meaningful to me, and I think I bought it out of a kind of naive adolescent, I mean, I was an adolescent, naive adolescent love for one particular poem, which was "He wishes for the cloths of heaven." And it was about, because it contains those lines about, tread softly, for you tread on my dreams. Every adolescent feels the world is trampling on their dreams, and I felt the poem was speaking for me, although I think Yeats meant something far more profound. I wonder if you have a memory of the very first poem that ever meant something to you in a personal way.
Well, actually, it's more, my relationship with poetry began, as so often people's relationships to poetry, in a time of incredible emotional need. You know, in adulthood, I found so many people come to me looking for poetry when they're grieving or they have a broken heart. My need was that at the age of 8, I was sent to boarding school in that strange British habit of sending little children away to places where no one loves them. Poetry was the only thing at my prep school that I was considered good at. I was good at reading poetry aloud, and I won the Hampshire Under-11 Latin reading competition and a 10-shilling book token, which gives you an idea of my age. And that was the only thing that I sort of held me together. And when I went to a big school, where I was taught by the same English teacher as Peter Frankopan and Pico Iyer, I continued that business of learning and reading poetry. And I suppose in retrospect, I realized that I had another very traumatic moment in my early 20s. I was crossing the Cromwell Road in London, which, for those of you who know it, is a big 6-lane highway. And I was waiting with a crowd of people for the lights to change. And when the lights went red, an eager man stepped out into the road and was promptly mown down by a car jumping the lights. And I can still not just see it, but hear the appalling noises that a car accident gives you. And anyway, there was a first aider in the crowd, and he grabbed me, and we rushed towards this body on the road, and there was no pulse, but this first aider managed to get a faint pulse back. And then an ambulance came, and then we took statements with the police, and suddenly I was standing on the same spot by the red lights, and the traffic was moving again, and the only evidence I had of this incredibly traumatic experience was that I had blood on my hands. And I had recently learnt a poem by Philip Larkin called Ambulances, which is all about that moment when you see your next door neighbour be collected by an ambulance for possibly the last time, and you're never going to see them again. And you sense the solving emptiness that lies just under everything we do, and for a moment get it whole, so permanent and blank and true. And that bit of poetry, I think in retrospect, was my first bit of self-medicating. The large gin and tonic in the pub probably helped, but I began to realize, I suppose, without really thinking about it, but just the power and the helpfulness of these words that I'd committed to memory. And so that's when, add another 20 years, and suddenly I'm actually practicing. And the extraordinary thing is that if I get the poem right for the person sitting telling me their anxieties, they get out of the chair a foot taller. There's something extraordinarily cathartic about it. And it touches me.
Well, it seems to touch them too. And that's the interesting part of this for me, because, the cynical reply to that would be, well, the gin and tonic is a far more palpable comfort in a situation like that. How can language be a comfort when you've been through a trauma?
Because we all go through enormous difficulties in our lives pretty much every day. And finding complicity for your anxieties, expressed rather more elegantly than you will ever be able to express yourself, makes you feel that you're not alone. You're not mad. And if those words were written hundreds of years ago, we've always felt like this. And therefore, it normalizes it and gives you a sense of comfort. The gin and tonic won't last long.
You've shared a couple of personal anecdotes. I'll share one too, which is that when I was very young, I was ill in hospital for many months. And it was at the time when other kids at school were learning to read, and a lot of adults came and read to me in hospital. And I believe my own love for language, storytelling, and books began there. They took me out of the hospital to other places and gave me a sense that there was a larger world than the one I was trapped in. So why did I end up writing novels and you end up loving poetry? There's something about poetry that performs a function maybe that other forms do not?
Well, I think so. I think that, first of all, there's something about the concision of poetry. I always feel you should read poetry rather differently from reading fiction or non-fiction or journalism. I feel that you should read poetry aloud. And I don't necessarily mean aloud. If you're on a bus, that might be problematic. But loud in your head. You should hear it. And I often say to people, read the same poem. A lot of people complain in the modern world they can't read a novel because they fall asleep at night and so forth. I say read the same poem 4 or 5 nights running, and you will find you'll get something different from it every single time. The layering of it, the musicality, the nuance, it'll prompt different thoughts. And therefore, I see it almost like a prayer.
This is a good moment to hear a poem being read aloud. I don't know if there's something you especially want to read, but it occurred to me as we're in these extraordinary surroundings that perhaps a poem by Mary Oliver, one of hers struck me in that anthology called Wild Geese, but if you have a poem you prefer to read, please do it.
Well, perhaps before we get to Mary Oliver, I'll try and give you a sense, because let's face it, I should think every single person in this tent has woken up at 4 in the morning with the kind of anxieties that reduce them to a childlike state, where you feel that you have no defenses for your anxieties. And for those of you who are parents, you'll know that the moment of parenthood is the beginning of a condemnation to worry for the rest of your life. Nobody warns you that in advance. But I found a wonderful poem, and I found it a very popular prescription for that 4 in the morning anxiety. And it's called The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. No, I live in the middle of London. There's no wood drake by my bedside. But even just mouthing those words to me in my head just seems to kind of calm the tumble-dryer mind that's going on, and gets my breathing back and helps me to drop off.
You've obviously felt like that for quite a long time, because one of the anecdotes that I've heard you tell is about going around London sticking up a copy of a particular poem. Is that one in...
It is.
It is? Would
it
you
is.
care to
I'll
share
find
it? Yeah.
So when I began National Poetry Day, I blagged £5,000 from the Arts Council to promote National Poetry Day, and being a 29-year-old with not much experience, I used the £5,000 to get posters printed of this poem, and like a sort of guerrilla really, I fly posted this poetry all around London, and not really being aware that fly posting was wholly illegal, and if the Arts Council discovered, I was going to be in terrible trouble. But I particularly got it done at moments where buses, double-deckers, had to stop, and I did it up at the second level on walls and things like that. And I wanted to find a poem that wasn't long, but prompted you to think. And this is a poem by an unknown poet, in the sense he's a bit like a kind of one-hit wonder from Top of the Pops, called Stuart Henson, and it's a poem called The Price. Sometimes it catches when the fumes rise up among the throbbing lights of cars, or as you look away to dodge eye contact with your own reflection in the carriage glass, or in a waiting room, a face reminds you that the colour supplements have lied, and some have pleasure, and some pay the price. Then all the small securities you built about your house, your desk, your calendar, are blown like straws, and momentarily, as if a scent of ivy or the earth had opened up a childhood door, you pause to take the measure of what might have been against the kind of life you settled for.
What was your aim in posting that particular poem? What did you hope?
I hope to provoke people to be honest. This was long before pharmacy days. I was just trying to unsettle people and get people to think about the power of poetry. I was just, as I said, trying to get poetry out of Poetry Corner. When I began in 1990, poetry was, and perhaps to some extent still is, a sort of fusty, dusty, back of a bookshop, slim volume, elite something that most people feel isn't for them. Somewhere around the age of 11, they're put off poetry at school as adolescence hits. They're put off by the mediators of poetry, actually, librarians, booksellers, bookshops, teachers. So many people who don't really have a grasp of poetry feel they ought to have it around, but don't, rather sort of put it in the corner. And I wanted to try and universalize it more and get the fear of poetry out of people's lives. To be honest, poetry is everywhere. I mean, for the last 30, 40 years, the most significant popular form of music is rap, which is filled with poetry. There's music on the jingles on the radio, that people use poetry in TV commercials. Half the poets I know are having to make a living as copywriters or something like that. And I think it's the P word that puts people off. It's not the poetry.
Well, your whole life, in a sense, seems to have been a campaign to make poetry something real and usable and human for people again. I mean, I was struck, there are a number of poets that you recommend or seem to prescribe over and over. One of them is Hafez, or Hafiz as he may be known, from 700 years ago. And when I looked him up, the descriptions online were along the lines that, well, he's very well known in Persia, and basically people use his lines as proverbs or as everyday stories, which seems to suggest a function for poetry that perhaps the West has lost and that maybe you'd like us to find again.
Well, that's very interesting. Many Iranians I've met have said, we have Hafez in our house and that's all we need. And actually, as I travel around the country, what seems so apparent was that the most common anxiety problem of the modern age, whether in leafy Kensington or in a slum in Liverpool, is loneliness. And it's really because of this. And how often do we now see on a park bench 3 people all looking at their phones and not engaging with each other? And it's this strange thing that there are so many social media platforms to communicate with each other, and yet in some ways we're more lonelier than ever. And I believe it's because there's something about this device which requires us almost to put an avatar of ourselves up. Nobody says on Instagram, I'm lonely, I'm miserable, I need a hug. They tell lots of lies. Look how glamorous my life is. Look where I've been. Look how many friends and likes I have. And that's challenging enough for adults to maintain that schizophrenia. Try being 12. And I found the most powerful poetic prescription of all for people were 2 lines by Hafez, generously translated by Daniel Ladinsky, so we mustn't fuss about the source. But he simply says, I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. And I gave it to somebody in Toxteth, in a mental health unit, and she wrote to me about 6 months later, because I told her to stick it on her mirror and learn it off by heart and say it every day. And she said, last night I was burgled, and when I got back to my flat, everything was in that awful mess that burglars do. And the only thing that hadn't shifted in that flat were those 2 lines of Hafez on my mirror. Thank you, she said. It got me through the night. And can I add one more little Hafez story? Because I was doing a pharmacy in London and at a kind of WeWork co-working place that was opening. And I was waiting for my 3:30 appointment to arrive, and the door knocked, and in walked the security guard. And he said to me, your 3:30's cancelled, he said, but can I take his place? And I said, yes, of course, please sit down. What's on your mind? And he sat down and he said, I came out when I was 24, but I'm 32 and I still don't have a relationship. And I said, that's tragic. What do you think this is all about? And he said, I don't know, I'm kind, I'm considerate, I'd be a good partner for someone, but the thing is, I'm Muslim and I'm gay and I can't be both. And I said, Hafez doesn't think so. And he was, a Sufi mystic. He really knew his stuff. And he wrote 700 years ago, it happens all the time in heaven. And one day it'll happen again on earth. That men and women who are married, and men who are lovers, and women who give each other light, will get down on bended knee with tears in their eyes and say to their loved one, how can I be more loving to you? How can I be more kind? And he got up with tears in his eyes and gave me the most enormous bear hug. And again, about 6 months later, I got a lovely email from him saying, I just want to say thank you. I'm dating.
Kind of brought tears to my eyes too. Have there been particular poems that have saved you or helped you at difficult moments?
I have a lot of poems that obviously, through these 2 books, and I've got another one coming out in September, I've spent a lifetime pursuing and looking for poems, and different poems help me in different times. My favorite poem of all time is, and I don't know why I find it so helpful, but it's a rather gloomy poem. And my mother, when she died, wrote in her will she wanted me to recite it at her memorial service. And it's a poem called Obeyed, and it's about waking up at night, in the middle of the night again. It's another 4 in the morning poem, and trying to assess the reality of fear of what's to come. And it goes like this. I work all day and get half drunk at night, waking at 4 to soundless dark. I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible. But how and where and when I shall myself die? Arid interrogation. Yet the fear of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and may never. The total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in, always. Nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. I'm sorry. Let me just flip that. And so it stays, just on the edge of vision, a small, unfocused blur, a standing chill which slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen. This one will. And realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we're caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined at than withstood. Slowly, light strengthens, and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe what we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. Meanwhile, telephones ring in locked-up offices, and all the intricate, uncaring, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay, with no sun. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house.
I've always found that a somewhat terrifying poem because it so elegantly encapsulates something everybody feels at one time or another, not always at 4 a.m. Which kind of goes to the heart of something else. It's something you have touched on. A poem in that Yeats anthology, which has come to mean a lot more to me than The Cloths of Heaven, is one called Adam's Curse, which is in part about how difficult it is to do anything, but in particular to write poetry, or at least that's how the poem begins. If a line does not seem a moment's thought, all our stitching and unstitching has been naught. In other words, enormous labor goes into making something seem light and momentary. The poem then goes on to talk about how hard it is to love, how much labor, if you like, goes into loving properly in the old high way. And then it ends, and I may get the poem wrong. We sat grown quiet at the name of love. We saw the last embers of daylight die, and in the trembling blue-green of the sky, a moon, worn as if it had been a shell, washed by time's waters as they rose and fell about the stars and broke in days and years. I had a thought for no one but your ears, that you were beautiful, and that I strove to love you in the old high way of love, that it had all seemed happy, and yet we'd grown as weary-hearted as that hollow moon. They're very beautiful lines, but they're very sad. And I could say the same about those lines you read by Philip Larkin. So again, we come to the question of, where's the consolation for your sadness in having your sadness reflected back at you?
Because, as I said earlier, complicity. You know, it's that sense we're not alone, and that these are the essence of humanity. And that's what I described it as the language of grace. You know, I haven't filled these poetry books with too much sadness. The people who come and see me are filled with sadness, and I'm trying to find an understanding of it, but also sometimes something cathartic that can help them. So there was a lovely man who was a great poet called Christopher Logue, and I don't know whether any of you knew him, but he sadly died 2 or 3 years ago. And he took a little poem by Apollinaire and worked his wonders with it. Hang on, let me just find the poem. And this is my cure, or prescription, for people who need courage in life. Many people come to see me and need courage. They want courage to leave a partner, they want courage to get a partner, they want courage to write a book, to paint a painting, to leave their job, to do something different. And what holds them back is fear. And Christopher Logue produced this wonderful tiny poem. It's called Come to the Edge. Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and they pushed, and they flew.
That's wonderful. I want to leave a little time for questions, but I'm curious to know. There's a form of therapy going on if I come to you with my troubles and you give me a poem in reply. But it's quite famously the case that with therapy, people firstly often don't know what's making them unhappy, and secondly, if they do know, might engage in huge evasions to avoid speaking it. So, do you encounter anything of that sort, or people coming to you and summing up their problems as in, I'm lonely, I'm ugly, I'm whatever they feel their affliction might be?
Well, no one's being forced to come and see me, and a lot of professionals, people are slightly forced to go there. And so, to some extent, I think that people are coming to talk to me prepared, that they want to tell me things. Often the way they sum it up isn't necessarily what's getting them underneath, and often, but it's intriguing. In some ways, I think in that 20 minutes, I'm probably only asking 3 or 4 questions. One is what's on your mind. The second is, what do you think it's really about? And the third is, going back to your childhood, where do you think this began? So I think that I'm really there because people need to be listened to, and people need safe places to pour their heart out. And I sat next to a shrink at dinner quite recently, and he said, I'm so envious of what you're doing. He said, because people have got a sort of contractual, cathartic, one-off opportunity to try and relieve themselves of something and to move on. He said, my lot are coming back next Thursday to say the same thing.
Have you had the same people coming back to you?
No.
Not ever?
No, because I haven't given people the opportunity to. And to a large extent as well, I don't want to create thousands of relationships with people. I made the mistake when I went around the country listening to 1,200 people's problems of not being supervised. And I didn't really understand quite what I was taking on. And I became very depressed. I was filled to the brim, really. Because in that 20 minutes, I felt I had to be ever present. I had to engage with those people. I had to hold eye contact. And I'm quite a sensitive person, and I sort of took everything on board rather than was able to deflect and unload. And yeah, it took its toll.
Is there anybody who'd like to ask Will a question? I could go on asking them myself, but I don't want to be selfish. Christina.
Thank you. Following on really from what you just asked, Damon, I wondered, William, if you ever worry that you might prescribe a poem that could damage people rather than help them.
Yes, that crossed my mind when I began to do it more and more. But to be honest, I kind of felt that almost everybody was coming for the chance to be heard. And if at times my prescriptions weren't apt, then perhaps they weren't getting quite as much resolution from the 20 minutes, but at least they were heard. And that my poetry armory was full of balms and salves rather than ones that would be problematic. I mean, even there's one poem which perhaps I could give you, which is a James Fenton poem, which I think's a very important poem because it's about mistakes, and boy, do we make them. But it would be a poem I would be very careful at prescribing because it might go the wrong way if you weren't feeling strong enough. Similarly, there are some people who come and see me who I feel actually the biggest help would be to go out and spend a bit of their time helping other people and to break out of their own cycle of self-obsession, recrimination, all those kinds of things. But I think this is a remarkable poem by James Fenton, and I think it will connect to everyone. It's called The Mistake. With the mistake, your life goes in reverse. Now you can see exactly what you did wrong yesterday and wrong the day before. And each mistake leads back to something worse. And every nuance of your hypocrisy towards yourself and every excuse stands solidly on the perspective lines. And there is perfect visibility. What an enlightenment. The colonnade rolls past on either side. You needn't move. The statues of your errors brush your sleeve. You watch the tail turn back, and you're dismayed. And this dismay at this big mistake, is made worse by the sight of all those who knew all along where those mistakes would lead. Those frozen friends who watched the crisis break. Why didn't they say? Oh, but they did indeed. Said with a murmur when the time was wrong, or by a mild refusal to assent, or told you plainly because you would not heed. Yes, you can hear them now. It hurts. It's worse than any sneer from any enemy. Take this dismay. Lay claim to this mistake. Look straight along the lines of this reverse.
Has the pharmacy changed the way you read poetry? In other words, now, instead of the simple pleasure you might have been looking for, are you looking for poems to prescribe?
Yes, I spent most of lockdown creating a children's pharmacy, which was illustrated by Emily Sutton, who's one of the great children's illustrators. And it's a beautiful hardback book. And it's made a bit simpler. It's poems to make you smile, poems to level and calm and connect you, so forth, because I thought that one of the most extraordinary impacts of COVID was the impact on children. And of course, it won't reveal itself for a very long time. But essentially, there were all these children now who can't remember what life was like before COVID, who went through 2 or 3 years of watching the adults around them unmoored, unhinged, and anxious, and all the stability and certainty that they needed to grow up with was gone. And so it sent me, during COVID, I really wanted to create something for them, for parents to read with their children, to help them uncover some of these anxieties.
Any other questions?
Behind the column over there.
Thank you. We've had some incredible sessions over the last 10 days, and some of them have been quite difficult to get through, really deep topics. And I wondered if you could give us your favorite poem to depict hope.
To depict?
Hope.
Yes. Hang on. If you give me a moment, because I'm trying to know it. I don't know it off by heart. Actually, I'm going to give you a better one. So, if you go to Anfield Football Ground in Liverpool on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, you'll find a lot of people singing. And if, when they came out of the ground, I said to them, I love that poem you sing, they'd probably nut me. But actually, Oscar Hammerstein wrote these lyrics for a musical called Carousel. And I've stolen them for a poetry prescription for hopelessness. And it goes like this. Walk on through the wind. Walk on through the rain. Though your dreams be tossed and blown, walk on. Walk on with hope in your heart. And you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. Because hope is the one thing that no one can take away from you.
We have time for another, if...
When putting together the collection for Everyone Sang and considering those poems, I was just wondering what advice you would have to librarians, teachers, booksellers, to better engage children in poetry.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that that children are really engaged with poetry. Children love it. It's where the reading starts. Reading poetry with carers, mum and dad, and all of that is I think what turns children into bookworms. And of course, nursery rhymes and so forth is where the process begins. The problem seems to be, as I mentioned before, at this sort of adolescent moment. And I think it's about trying to get poetry a broader sense of what poetry is. And one of the things I'm most proud of in my poetry life is every 10 years of the Forward Prize, I make a personal book of favourites called Poems of the Decade. It's my view of the best poetry from the last 10 years, but no poet gets more than one poem in it. And the second one of those has been the A-level English set text for the last 10 years. And I just love the idea as a person who, when I was at school, I defaced an awful lot of books. The idea that right across the country, there are lots of teenagers sort of inking my name. But at the same time, I love the idea that they are reading poetry that's only just been written, and therefore so much more relevant than the kind of poetry I had to read at school. So it's trying to get these contemporary voices and trying to get poets, booksellers, librarians, and teachers to just understand that poetry is all around them. Use the lyrics from rap.
On that note, is poetry winning or losing? Is it a dying
Oh, it's winning.
genre?
It's going through such boom times. It's the most marvelous thing. I often feel, you see, because we don't commune in the way we used to on a Friday or on a Sunday or whatever with our faith, we don't share these liturgies of poetry, which we used to recite together in a communal way, and that was tremendously important for our spirit. And it seems as though through lockdown, my phone was flooded with poetry from all kinds of sources, and it's as though the canon of poetry has become the secular liturgy. It's really exciting, and poetry book sales are booming. We're up nearly 100% over the last 5 years. And the other thing that made this happen was that poetry used to go through an incredibly narrow funnel. It went through sort of 6 poetry editors of various publishers in the UK who were all white, middle-aged, middle-class men. And so what they liked was pretty narrow. But now with social media, poets are going out there, they're putting on their poetry, and then they're getting hundreds of thousands of followers, and the publisher's going, blimey, I better publish her book. So it's a much more, early on, who was talking today about the Booker Prize and how when Salman Rushdie came along, yes, Pico was, how it all changed. The Forward Prize is such a diverse set of voices. I think we've had winners from Trinidad, Jamaica, Brooklyn, all kinds of places all over the world. And that's what's making poetry so exciting.
We have to finish at 5:30 because there's a boat cruise coming, but I'd love to end on perhaps by tapping into what's been mentioned before, the anecdote you told about the security guard who took comfort from Hafez and a poem written 700 years before he was born. The fact that poetry can join lives over great gulfs of time, as if you're sitting in the same room together. I love that Alan Bennett poem that you cite in that regard, and I wonder if you'd read that for us as a way of closing.
Well, actually, it's not a bit of poem, a poem by Alan and Bennett, but it's actually just a quote from a book. But he said, the best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you'd thought special and particular to you. Now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, and it is as if a hand has reached out and taken yours.
Beautiful note to end on. Please give a hand to William Sieghart.